Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am Michele Calvello from the University of Salerno and the LARAM International School on Landslide Risk Assessment and Mitigation. Today's lecture will be devoted to landslide early warning systems. What are they? How do they address landslide risk? What are their elements? How are they employed in the world? At what scales? Local scale, regional scale, territorial scale? We will see all of that. Let's start right away. I would like to start with a definition. It's a definition from the UN ISDR, the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. And nowadays, you will find this international agency from the UN with the name of UNDRR. I like this definition from 2009, even more than the definition that they put forward later on. Anyway, you can find it on the terminology section of the UNDRR site, because this definition encompasses the main, portrays the main elements of early warning systems. Generally speaking, now we're talking about early warning systems, not specifically devoted to landslides, but early warning, because early warning systems can be devised for many natural hazards. And I like the fact that they call the systems a set of capacities, not an ensemble of tools or parts, but a set of capacities. What are their needs? At the center of everything, there are people. We are warning people, individuals, communities, organizations. And we do that by disseminating timely and meaningful information. So warning means giving to people timely and meaningful information. Why? Because these people are the elements at risk that we are addressing in our risk mitigation strategy. Early warning is one of the possible options that we have for reducing risk, by telling these people to prepare and act appropriately and in sufficient time to reduce the possibility of harm or loss. We need early warnings. Let me see if I will use the pen, actually the highlighter for something. So let's put it here for me, right? So the idea is that we will reduce risk by telling people what to do, when to do it in a meaningful way. Timely, meaningful. So those are all important words here. That's why I like this definition. Relatively short, has all the elements that are really essential for defining both the components and the aims of early warning systems. Another way of seeing that, again, it's the UNISDR in those years, so let's say more than 10 years ago, now it's 2021, so in 2006 first, and then in 2009 later, they devised this graphical depiction of the elements of early warning systems. And the four key elements are risk knowledge, monitoring and warning service, dissemination and communication, response capabilities. Right away, I want to highlight the fact that warning systems are not monitoring systems. Oops, light blue over blue doesn't quite work. Let's use the pen instead. Monitoring, warning is a component of an early warning system. So the monitoring and warning service is one of the essential components of a system, but we need to know what we are monitoring first. So risk knowledge is key. And also, two out of these four components, as you can see here, are non-technical components. It's very relevant to address the issue of dissemination and communication when you're dealing with landslide early warning systems. It's relevant throughout the risk management process, but in early warning system is really key to understand what you are giving, for instance, as a message to the people that you are trying to advise in order for them to act appropriately, as we said before. So is the warning information usable, clear? Are the risks and the warnings understood? Those are questions that needs to be addressed when you are devising an early warning system. And also the response capability of the people, communities that you are warning is an important component element of the system. So in this particular schematic, you see 2/4 of the schematic are technical components: risk knowledge, monitoring, warning service. The other half, the other 2/4, are non-technical components: dissemination, communication, response capability. It is very important to highlight this right at the beginning. When we move to landslides and I look at the literature, I look at the examples where people have been trying to put schematics on the activities, the components of landslide early warning systems. If we go back to 2007, this flowchart comes from two researchers from Norway, Dibiajo and Kistad. You can see that the 4 activities that they highlight, so the monitoring, the analysis and forecasting, the warning, and finally the response, are structured in a classical flowchart, a technical flowchart that we know how to handle. They are sequential. Yes, there's some feedback here. For instance, after monitoring, if you don't think that you're not, I mean, you perform the analysis and forecasting, and if the analysis and forecasting doesn't tell you that there is a danger, then you go back and you keep monitoring. But besides this loop, it's a sequential set of activities. And then you move after you understand with your analysis. If you understand with your analysis that something needs to be done, you issue a warning, you do the warning, and then you expect the response. Emergency plans are highlighted here as tools that are there for people to respond. But it's a sequential schematic that starts with the instruments. At the top of everything, it's instruments. So it's really focused on the technical components of the systems. Later on, also because of drawing from the experience of other disciplines, and as we showed just in the previous slide, the UNDRR produced that schematic with the 4 activities, 4 components that I just illustrated to you. Also in the landslide arena, people, researchers working with landslides have been devising, thinking about systems, landslide early warning systems, as something that goes beyond all the technical part. In this case, 3 out of 4 components are technical. These authors, Intrigue and co-authors, they say that it's important to think about the design, then the monitoring, and then the forecasting. Somehow they split monitoring and warning into monitoring and forecasting, and then you have anyway a 4th non-technical component herein called education. But besides the proposal of definition of terms, design, monitoring, forecasting, and education, what's relevant here for me to highlight for you, it's that it is important indeed, also in the landslide arena, for what we are dealing with, to address the systems, the landslide early warning systems, in their considering the complex interaction between technical components and non-technical components. Anyway, considering these everything. With this introduction, I can move on to the presentation, to the lecture, that it's structured as you see here. We will start talking about landslides, but very briefly, of course. I will just introduce those elements of the landslides classification and ideas about triggering and predisposing factors that we are not addressing in this lecture, but still we need those elements in order to understand landside early warning systems by means of examples. Before that, I will also briefly touch upon another issue that if you saw my previous lecture on landslide risk management, you know a lot about it, but now we'll just take the framework to understand where landslide early warning systems are within that framework. And then the examples will be used, no, at the beginning I will say something, but then later on, after I will show the components of the landslide early warning systems, we will go, I will go in detail explaining some, illustrating some of the systems that are available worldwide, so more examples. And finally, in the final part of the presentation, I will talk about the warning model. I want to say that, so this is my final part of the presentation. I want to say that the issue of risk perception is also very, very relevant. As I mentioned, the non-technical components are key, but we won't have time to address that issue. I'll just like mention it here for you. And risk perception is related to communication and education, is related to people's participation, to the activities needed in order for them to act properly. It is related, of course, to the emergency plans, to planning for emergencies. Therefore, it is in some way related to what nowadays we tend to call resilience, community resilience, how community cope with risks in general, landslide risk in particular. And it's very relevant during emergencies to address the issue of how people behave and therefore what's the risk perception. But I'm saying to you that we won't have time to cover this in this lecture. I will address all of that, mentioning specifically the different, telling to you that there are two classes of systems. Indeed, we can say that there are systems working at local scale. We can say that there are systems working at territorial scale. Territorial scale, what I call territorial warning systems, territorial landslide early warning systems, may mean different things. It could be systems devised for a municipality. It could be systems devised for a nation. So like the area may change widely, but the difference between them and local systems is quite clear. When we are addressing a single landslide, a single slope, a single landslide system or single catchment getting potentially affecting a community specifically because it's that catchment, that it's our area of attention, that's local. When we move to territorial systems, we are addressing areas where multiple landslides may occur and where also our prediction capability, our forecasting is based on models that are developed at territorial level, not at local level. Therefore, they have, we are using different approaches. Very key difference, local and territorial systems. And throughout the presentation, you will see that it is really indeed a combination of disciplines that are needed in order to properly design and manage landslide early warning systems. So the multidisciplinary approach is key to this particular mitigation strategy, landslide early warning systems. I said I would start from landslides very briefly. Landslides are many different things. I guess if you are here following this, you know it. And many different things could be, for instance, debris flow, something that it's small at the beginning, but has a large, long mobility, high velocity. It could be slow moving landslides. You can see clearly here the landslides, the scarp out here. the main scarp of the landslide, you can see that this is an active movement by just looking at the picture, yet active in this case for this movement means centimeters, meters per year, not centimeters, meters, or many meters per second. So landslides are many different things. All these pictures come from a single article. That is indeed an article where these authors are talking about classification. So they say Barnes classification and update. Barnes classification and update, because if you look at the many classification systems and proposals that are out there, indeed, there are many, starting from early work in the Alps, between Switzerland and Austria a little bit. Really, if we don't go back to those very early works, let's concentrate on maybe the most well-known classification system, the one that was developed by Barnes in 1978. And indeed, the article that I was mentioning and the pictures that I showed you before, they are taken from this article that is the most recent contribution to this particular topic in the literature, updating, sorry, sorry for my voice, updating indeed the Barnes classification from 1978. We are not addressing this in this lecture because it's out of topic, but it's important to understand that when we are devising, designing, thinking about an early warning system for landslides, then we have to think about monitoring and modeling strategies for early warning purposes. We cannot neglect the type of phenomena that we are addressing. Therefore, the classification, mainly the features of the landslides, are very important for us to devise a correct system. So to define the correct monitoring and modeling strategies. I would like to summarize visually what I just said by highlighting for you that the main variables of the landslides that we have to think about, take into account, are the typology of the landslide, that is also related to material, the typology and material together. And to this aim, we can think at the classical classification system by Barnes, Angre, and co-authors. I already mentioned them. State of practice, how people call phenomena in your specific area, nation. But we have to think also at the phase of activity. Two references for you are here for you because we have to differentiate between reactivations and first failure movements. They are very different things. We have to think about velocity, fast moving or slow moving landslides. No, very different things. Volume, very small landslides, very large landslides. You know, all of that together. Of course, things are interrelated. I created here for you a graphical depiction of the interaction between all these variables, and for us, for you to understand where we stand in terms of velocity and volume when we are talking about specific types of landslides in certain materials. For instance, rockfalls. Rockfalls are typically not very large, so not very large. So this is the range of volume, qualitatively speaking, but they are typically very fast. Rock avalanches, they are fast and also large. They are maybe the worst. Rapid mass movements include also debris flows, hyperconcentrated flows. All of those are typically first failures. When we move to reactivations are typically slow. So you can see here. And then reactivations could be different things because you can have deep-seated slides, large bodies of the earth moving slowly or very slowly, but you can even have shallow slides. And shallow slides, if they are in fine-grained materials, so in clay or silty soils, they are typically slow. They produce slow movements, but they could be, fast movements if we are considering shallow slides in coarse-grained materials. So all of that to highlight for you that the typology of landslide, its material, the phase of activity, the volume, the velocity, they are not independent variables, as we just saw, are important to define where you stand in this, I would call it the universe of phenomena that comprise, that we can call landslides. Okay, it's very important to understand where you stand. What is the scope of your system? Once we have defined the type of landslides that we are addressing with our system, then another very key issue is the scale. I was mentioning it to you already, at the beginning, when I was showing you the outline of the lecture. And when we think of scale, and we address the predisposing and triggering factors of the phenomena of interest, or the phenomenon of interest, if we think about local scale, globe scale, that's what I wrote here for you, we may refer to classical geotechnics. Terzaghi, already in the 1950s, Terzaghi, the father of geotechnics, in the 1950s said there are some internal factors that you have to take into account when you are dealing with the earth for civil engineering purposes, soil mechanics and geotechnics indeed. Geostructural setting, mechanical behavior of materials, groundwater regime. This particular article, I forgot here to put the reference, but it's a well-known historical article from Terzaghi dealing with landslides in 1950, 70 plus years ago. So he identifies three typologies of internal factors: geostructural setting, mechanical behavior of materials, and groundwater regime. So it's important all of them are important when you're working at slope scale. Well, the same things are important also, of course, regionally when you're working at regional scale, but you don't go and you cannot go and characterize in detail the mechanical behavior of all the materials that you have. You cannot go and monitor in detail everywhere the groundwater to understand the regime of the groundwater flow. So my references here for you when you're thinking about predisposing and triggering factor for different types of landslides at regional scale are indeed the references that, if you looked at the lecture where I was talking about susceptibility and zoning, I mentioned a lot, and I illustrated in great detail. So Fell and Co-authors in 2008 with their guidelines for landslide zoning may provide you the references for thinking about predisposing and triggering factors at regional scale. Now, for warning purposes, for our warning systems, indeed, the vast majority, almost all the warning systems that we devise that are operational worldwide, that have been operational worldwide, are related to rainfall. Maybe here I wrote rainfall, I can say weather more generally. I can even say climate. Nowadays, some people are calling climate induced, let's say, sometimes they say extreme climate events produce effects, so you can say climate induced landslides. Anyway, besides the terminology, rainfall induced or weather induced or climate induced landslides can be addressed both at slope scale, sorry, not with at slope scale, and at regional scale. When you're talking about anthropic activities, some of them, for instance, I'm thinking about mining. Very often you are within a mining area. People are worried about possible slope instabilities, landslides. Therefore, among other things, there may be systems in place, monitoring and then in general warning systems in place to address that issue. You can do it, and not at regional scale, not at territorial level. And for seismic induced landslides, you cannot really forecast, given that you cannot forecast the earthquakes in advance, and you don't have those at slope scale. I'm putting these for regional scale because you may say that once you have an earthquake, you may have some models there, therefore some systems there that may tell you where most likely you will have landslide, seismically induced landslides in the area where the earthquakes happen on the basis of the characteristics of the earthquake. But the vast majority, as I said, of landslide early warning systems deal with weather-induced phenomena. Therefore, that will be the topic of interest for us also in this lecture. Where do we stand in the landslide risk management process that you know if you follow my previous lecture? Of course, as I said, we need to understand at the beginning what type of phenomena we are addressing. So this part is the landslide or danger characterization that will define our interest. What type of phenomena are we addressing? But then with landslide early warning systems, we are in the final part of the risk management process. We are where we define risk mitigation actions. And among the different risk mitigation options, landslide early warning is one of the options that we have. So that's where we are within this framework. Very easy, I guess, very straightforward. Maybe not as straightforward is understanding what this schematic means. If we go back to the international, some guidelines by the international standard organizations, those are the guidelines on risk management. I'm referring to the ones from 2009, but even the latest version, it was 2018, if I'm not mistaken, as the same definition. Risk is defined as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. General definition, short, very general. If you have phenomena like all of the phenomena that we are dealing with that cannot be defined deterministically, therefore you have uncertainties, the effect of the uncertainties of your knowledge about the phenomena of interest will those uncertainties will have an effect on the objectives that you have for your study, for your analysis. In our case, so this is a general definition that where you include in risk in the risk definition also positive risks. For instance, when you bet on something, you assume a positive, you bet on the fact that you may win something, not necessarily lose when you need. But anyway, I don't want to go off track here. I just want to say, though, that in the same guidelines, this depiction is something that we can say similar to what we saw before for the landslide risk management process. You start with establishing the context, scope of your analysis. You move on to identification, analysis, evaluation. The terms are slightly different, but the meaning is you first identify and compute risk and the analysis, then you assess it, evaluate it. At the end, you treat the risk that you just evaluated. and you treat it in the ways that are appropriate according also to your evaluation, comparing, as we said, very in detail in our previous lecture, comparing your computations with criteria, no, with assessment criteria. Here, though, in this particular schematic, you see there is, interactions shown also graphically at every level, interaction with what's called communication and consultation, and what's called monitoring and review. It is very important, so the framework here clearly highlights that, to address what you are doing to cope with risk at all stages by always going in the place, in the community, in the arena where your risk is assessed, identified, analyzed, evaluated. Communication and consultation is a key element of the risk management process, as well as a continuous monitoring, in the sense of monitoring of the activities that you're performing, not monitoring of the variables, monitoring a review of what you're doing. So this is important to highlight. I'm doing this, I'm highlighting this for you because with reference to landslide early warning systems, we can say that risk mitigation by early warning, also in the schematics, appears at the bottom of the schematic, but highlights I want to highlight for you, just by exploiting this schematic, that it's not only researchers, let's say technicians and people that are devising the models that are indeed a key component in designing and managing early warning systems, but you have to consider that there are people, I already mentioned it, I'm doing it again, people on one side, because they are the ones where the messages have to go, and they are the ones that have to act appropriately to those messages. And let's call them technicians, researchers, practitioners, experts on the other side, not forgetting that systems are typically managed by institutions, authorities, therefore managers. So the interaction between people, researchers, and managers, but most importantly, the acknowledgement that there are people, researchers, and managers that are interacting in devising early warning systems in order for them to be effective, at the end of the story, managers want systems that are effective. In order, therefore, for the system to be effective, one of the ingredients, very key, important ingredient, is the efficiency of the model that is there, that produces the warning. And the efficiency of the model in turns depends on the capability to monitor the right variables with the right frequency in the right way, to have good data. But besides all of that, it's clear that also risk perception plays a big role, and all of that in the arena of the risk of early warning has to be managed by managers, that at the end of the story want effective systems. Some examples of landslide early warning systems coming from the literature, not only from the scientific literature, but even from the gray literature or from well-explained websites. I tried with some co-authors, former PhD students of mine, to systematize the state of practice. We came up with 2 articles in 2018 and 2019, respectively, dealing with territorial systems, the first one, and local system, the last one. Here you have the references if you want to read them. We highlighted a few, we identified and commented on a few systems at territorial scale and a few systems at local scale in different parts of the world. In these particular pictures down here, you can see that some of them, the most, let's say, the oldest system is the one from Hong Kong, still operational to date. Here, the date was 2016, but it is still operational today in 2021. And there are many others. As you can see, you can see from what are these red boxes that appear a few times in this depiction, where time moves from, as I said, the 70s, 1970s, all the way to recent years. These boxes are important major landslide events that occurred in the areas where systems are then have been then implemented. Sometimes, it takes a few years anyway, but it's the major events that trigger, let's use this word, that trigger authorities into action, into acting, and acting by devising, setting up early warning systems. Okay, anyway, if you want more details, you can look at the papers. The second one also concentrates on monitoring strategies, as the title says. But I want to highlight for you a few names, a few, let's say, famous landslides and landslide early warning systems. At slope scale, a very well-studied case is the case of the Håknes landslide in Norway. Why is that well-studied? Because it is indeed a rock slide, very, very large, 54 estimated volume, 54 million cubic meters, active. It may have a sudden it's active, but it may have a sudden acceleration of movements because it's active, but it's slow moving. And if that happens, the problem is not that it will go and hit the valley below. Given that it's on a slope in a fjord, the problem is that if it fails with a very large volume, there is a tsunami. There will be a tsunami. And so the major risk there is nobody's living on the landslide. So there are no people directly exposed to the possible failure of the landslide, but there is the indirect risk scenario with another hazard, tsunami, and the tsunami may affect significantly many villages around the fjord and close to this landslide. Here I put the references for you in terms of short names, authors, and year, but you can easily find them if you're interested in on the web or on Scopus, wherever. Another well-known, very well-studied landslide at slope scale is the Illgraben landslide. Indeed, it's not a landslide. Illgraben catchment. What's the problem here? Debris flows. Small catchment, many debris flows occurring year after year. And so people in Switzerland have been studying it extensively, and there is a warning system in place, and it's a very interesting warning system. Examples of warning systems also started to appear in the last 10 years in China because of the Three Gorges Reservoir operation, a very huge reservoir because of the Three Gorges Dam. You may know it, you may not know it. Anyway, there is the Yangtze River and the dam, a very huge reservoir, 800 kilometers long, and fluctuations of water level because of the dam, because it's used for many purposes, hydroelectric, also flood control, and many active landslides. So the dam and the reservoir are triggering landslides, many, and many of them have warning systems in place. Okay, the last one I'm mentioning it's indeed a natural dam that it's there because of a very, very old seismically triggered rock slide, and in case it fails, it may produce extensive damage. So the risk is there is for a possible dam break. But anyway, this is a very specific situation. At regional scale, moving on at regional scale, as I already said, the oldest and longest running system is the one from Hong Kong, developed and managed by the Hong Kong Geotechnical Engineering Office from 1977. The area of Hong Kong is about 1,000 kilometers squared. You can find some details in these papers, and even in a more recent paper, if I'm not mistaken, it's there is a more recent paper from 2021, was published last year online, and I guess it went, let's say 2020, last year online in the journal Landslides. Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, following a very disastrous landslide event in the city, they really devised a system based in the 90s on what Hong Kong has been done in the 70s of the previous century. And you can find some details on this system. I also published because I was there in Brazil for a while, working together with these people at the Municipal Geotechnical Engineering Office. Other relevant systems in Seattle, smaller area, or national systems like Japan, the whole country, Norway, the whole country. So at regional scale, territorial systems may be, as I said, municipal, or addressing relatively small areas at regional scale, but it can go all the way to address the entire nation. Norway, Japan, and other nations have such systems. In Italy, I come from Italy, I tell you something about Italy. In Italy, the territorial warning systems exist and are developed at regional scales. We have 21 regions, indeed it's 20, but anyway, 21 different systems, 21 regions. For each one of them, based on some guidelines that are indeed national guidelines, the people in the regions are developing the specific regional landslide, not only landslide, early warning system for hydrogeological and hydraulic critical scenarios that come from extreme weather events. This table is in Italian, but well, no, indeed, I translated some of parts of the table. All this part is translated for you in English. We have essentially 4 levels of alert, from green to red. So green, yellow, orange, or red. Green is the base condition. You may go into a warning when you have some, your forecasts are telling you that some events may happen. What kind of events? Geo events or hydro events? Let's concentrate on landslides. Geo events, possible isolated erosional processes, shallow landslides, debris flows, rock falls, or occasional landslides where hydrogeological conditions are particularly critical. When you think that you are in this situation, and there are models, of course, different models in different regions, but anyway, there are models that tell you that you are in that situation, you go into yellow, and yellow indeed means this. What does orange means? Orange means that your shallow landslide and debris flows, now maybe more in the area, in a specific area that is a warning zone. Red means, red or red, you cannot see much, but anyway, red means, let's put the arrows. that your shallow landslides and debris flows can be even more. So you move from possible to diffuse to numerous and diffuse shallow landslides and debris flows. We are not giving numbers, but we are saying to the managers of the areas, look, there could be something once you are in the yellow scenario. There could be something significant with diffuse shallow landslides and debris flows when you are in the orange scenario. Look, really, the chances of having numerous shallow landslides and debris flows are high when you are in the red scenario. I'm highlighting shallow landslides and debris flows because essentially that's where the difference between these systems is. Because anyway, rockfalls are possible, you know, possible. And we don't say much more about deep-seated landslides or other types of landslides. We say possible again for deep-seated landslides, but the idea is that these systems at regional scales, at least for landslides, we're also talking about floods here with hydro part, but for landslides, address essentially shallow landslides and debris flows. As we see from the event scenarios description that I just read and commented for you. Therefore, let's go to what types of systems we may have. Because in the literature, there are names that sometimes don't mean for the same thing for different people, actors. A very interesting paper by Manfred Staley and co-authors from Switzerland in 2015 differentiated between alarm systems, warning systems, and forecasting systems. In this paper, they were addressing specifically rapid mass movements that affect the Alps, Switzerland very much. But no, this classification is somehow general. Alarm, why alarm? Alarm if there is the monitoring of a process and the parameters of this process that initiate an alarm automatically. For instance, you may have a red flashing lights, you may have a siren, you may have you may close a road, these sort of things. Alarm systems. Warning systems are here defined differently, and their aim specifically is to detect changes in the environment. You are monitoring time-dependent factors. For instance, you are monitoring crowd opening, you're monitoring the rain. That is indeed what you are monitoring most of the times for rainfall-induced landslides. Before the phenomenon, of course, in order to analyze the situation and implement appropriate intervention measures. So here, you don't have the siren, or let's say, I don't have to say necessarily the siren. You don't have the alarm initiated automatically. You may move to another category of system, herein called forecasting system, if when you are predicting your processes, here is the rapid mass movement processes, in your prediction, you do those predictions at regular intervals. Therefore, you are not basing your the actions of the warnings on thresholds, but you conduct only on thresholds, let's say, but you conduct on a regular basis, and typically it's every day, at least every day, when you have such systems, your assessment, and then based on your assessment, you may give bulletins, or you may assign a color code to an area. So this is the difference that they propose. Alarm, warning, forecasting. I must tell you, I have to tell you that it's sometimes, complicated to use those words. I like their proposal, but at the same time, out there in the world, people are typically thinking about warning systems. Even if they are alarm systems, they call them warning systems. Even if they are forecasting systems, they call them warning systems. So I personally prefer to talk about landslide early warning systems for everything, landslide early warning systems. Yet, if you refer to scale, and I indeed already referred to scale at the beginning of the presentation, and I mentioned it already, when you are addressing and working with systems at slope scale, you are typically going in the alarm systems. When you are addressing or working with systems at regional scale, you are typically going with your forecasting systems. Of course, there is always an area in between, the warning in between. So the differentiation here for me is essentially the same, of what Stanley and Kotos proposed, but I'm not going to use alarm, warning, forecasting, differentiating between systems. I'm going to say landside early warning systems at slope scale, landside early warning systems at regional scale. And so you can see that this table somehow summarizes what I already said. Maybe just like a brief mention to the lead time. Lead time is a key part of your forecasting activity. How much in advance are you able to give a warning to the people that you're warning? So if you do it at regular intervals, if you do your assessments at regular intervals, even your lead time, is basically related to the frequency of your regular intervals. And if the frequency is daily, basically that's what you're saying. The day before, for the day after, what's happening for the next day, within the next 24 hours. When you have alarm systems, typically the lead time is short, but it's very sharp and typically automatic. Okay, we already said what we had to say about it. In the same paper, an interesting table is this one, where you can see, depending on the type of systems, so forecasting or warning or alarms, what types of parameters and with what technology you are typically monitoring. So if I'm saying, I already said, if I said that rainfall, precipitation, let's write rainfall, is the most widely monitored parameter, it's because also for forecasting systems, you do it relatively easily. So rainfall means intensity, cumulative precipitation, anyway, indicators related to rainfall with rain gauges and more recently with radars. You use rainfall for forecasting systems, as well as sometimes, but not very often, soil moisture, snow, if you have snow, okay, the Alps have snow, and soil moisture data, if you want to go into the soil and not just thinking about the trigger. When you are moving to warning systems and alarm systems, you start and you may want to monitor displacements, or even something strange, not strange, sorry, something like precursors of failure. And sometimes, anyway, precursors of failures by means of acoustic sensors. Acoustic sensors, you find geophones that are indeed acoustic sensors. Also down here, when you are monitoring something already occurring. So something already occurring, debris flow will produce noise, and this noise, you may pick up the noise to understand, oh, there is a debris flow occurring, or there is the noise of the mass that is deforming prior to failure. In that case, you have some precursory knowledge. Anyway, if you are analyzing displacements, if you are analyzing the real movement going on, you are typically in the warning systems or alarm systems realm. All right. I didn't mention, soil moisture is a general terms to mention not only water content, but also everything that is related to measures in the soil, like positive or negative pore water pressures. So we were now we were moving towards what measures we need. So let's think about specifically the monitoring strategy. I would like to show this for you by means of this simple figure that you find in this article. It was indeed the ranking lecture by Leroy in 2001. Rain will produce changes in the groundwater. So the weather, let's say the weather, not only rain, rainfall, snow, will produce effects on the soil that's our interest. The interest for us, it's the soil mass, the rock mass. The effect will be on the groundwater, and the effect on the groundwater, of course, will be an effect on the mechanical behavior, therefore soil deformations. So changes of pore water pressures, water contents will mean or may mean ground displacements, surface displacements, or underground displacements. Let's call them slope displacements, both before a collapse or after, during a collapse, pre-failure, post-failure reactivation. You may have anthropic cone causes in these, but if we are thinking about, as I said, we are thinking about weather-induced landslides, the weather, the groundwater, the soil deformations. It's quite straightforward, at least from an engineering geotechnical point of view, quite straightforward. I tried to put together monitoring methods, the monitored parameters in this table. This is analogous to the table that I showed you before by Stali and co-authors. In this table, I'm saying that you have essentially the possibility of monitoring the deformation activity, the groundwater, or the trigger, and to a certain extent also predisposing factors. And you can do that by monitoring different specific parameters: displacement, strains, rockfall event frequency for the deformation activity, or indeed pore water pressure, suction, soil humidity for the groundwater. And as I said, trigger, if the trigger is the weather, indeed you are measuring rain or water saturation. No, water saturation, no, WS, what does it mean? Let me read. No, weather station, rain by means of. Inside this table, you find acronyms. Those acronyms, if you cannot read them on the slide, they are very small. You go back to my article and you will find the original table. What I want to highlight for you is the fact that you may measure different parameters by different methods. Essentially, I call the geotechnical methods and technologies the ones that are related to ground deformation or pore water pressure and suction measures. I called hydro methods the ones that are related to water, free water, stream flow, water qualities, these sort of things. You may have geophysics, geophysical methods. You may have geodetic to measure the surface movements. You may have remote sensing, and you can see a lot going on in the remote sensing community has been going on in the past, let's say, 20 years, or meteorological monitoring. Besides the details of the different possibilities that you have, I just want to recall for you that we don't have to forget what we are monitoring. So don't forget what you're monitoring: type of landslide, material, phase of activity, velocity, volume. So what is the object of your monitoring activity? Okay, once you don't forget that, that's the base. Also, your monitoring device, your measuring device, will have to comply to some needs. You have to understand that you have to see, you have to have devices that are robust, that have certain needed accuracy. You may need certain accuracies, but then, maybe you don't want to spend a lot of money. So like the balance between costs, accuracy, precision, you may want to implement it in places where it's easy to do that, ease of implementation. All of these are factors that will affect your choices on what particular type of measuring device you will indeed put forward in your monitoring strategy, not forgetting that different things typically happen at local scale and at territorial scale. Local landside reporting systems, territorial landside reporting systems. I have a slide here for you related to the scales. Slope scale to the left, regional scale to the right. The local early warning, so this final thing, is the result of a real-time monitoring, typically multi-parametric with many parameters there, activity. So you decide the parameters to monitor, and you do that on the basis of what you want to protect, your elements at risks, and also on the basis of your knowledge on the slope to monitor, for geotechnical variables, parameters to monitor. Then you have this strategy, your monitoring strategy here, that will produce, by means of a local model, your forecast of the slope response. And the forecast of the slope response, in turn, will produce local early warning. This is a schematic showing how a monitoring strategy at local scale works. At regional scale, your final territorial early warning is, yes, indeed based on monitoring, real-time monitoring. Most typically is rainfall monitoring only. Sometimes there is more. And this is done in relation to a territorial model. Let's highlight this for you here. That indeed will produce over areas that are indeed areas that are wide. The warning zone, a single warning zone could be 2,000 kilometers squared, more than that, less than that. So big areas. You cannot go there and so you're forecasting something with reference to the entire zone that is your zone of interest. When you do that, typically your territorial model indeed will produce something that can be seen as a susceptibility indicator. Anyway, something that at the end will produce some warning. Why did I put these for you here? Significant slopes. I put this here for you because now I will have this arrow here. Indeed, the two systems, the two different scales, scales of systems are indeed producing different monitoring strategies and different approaches to the warnings, yet an integration of the two typologies of systems is possible. And indeed, I think people are working at this integration. In the past few years, there have been some attempts. I'm personally also working on that integration. I see the integration happening at the level of significant slopes for your area. Those significant slopes for your area at territorial scale may be related to specific slopes that are monitored for warning purposes at slope scale, and there may be an exchange of information that is important that may upgrade your prediction capabilities both at slope scale and at regional scale. So the integration, in my mind, happens at that level, at the level of the significant slopes to monitor, the slopes that are monitored at slope scale. That said, I'm arriving at the final part of this first section of the lecture. What I mean, after all we said, the components of the landside early warning systems. Okay, we started with some propositions from literature of schematic propositions of components, activities, elements. I'm going to highlight here for you one possibility of identifying the main components of early warning systems for weather-induced landslides. More details you can find them on this article. That anyway I will mention also at the end. It's the main reference for this lecture. I see at the center of everything the landslide model. I'm not using the words warning yet. The landslide model is a model that tries to relate, when you are thinking about weather-induced landslides, tries to relate the landslide event to weather conditions. You do that if you are within our early warning systems because you have monitoring, and of course you must have the knowledge of your territory, both at slope scale or at large scale, different ways of getting your knowledge. But anyway, the geo characterization here means geotechnical, geo-environmental, geological, geomorphological. So understanding the characteristics of the territory is key, of course, to develop a landslide model. The landslide model relates the weather conditions to the landslide events by means of monitoring. Whatever it is, like it may take the form of a simple equation. It may take the form of a correlation between rainfall and possibility of occurrence. It may take the form of a model physically based that starts from rainfall infiltration at the surface and ends with deformations in the soil mass. Whatever, you need a landslide model as the essential module, let's call it module, of your system. When you want a system, though, an early warning system, you need also a warning model. A warning model for me is everything that you see in this picture up to now. It is the landslide model plus warning criteria. You have to decide, for instance, if you're thinking about only monitoring rainfall at regional scale, what are the thresholds of the rainfall intensity that you use to produce a yellow state of alert, an orange state of alert, and a red state of alert? And you need to define what a warning event is. So you have to define what indeed means for you overcoming a certain threshold or overcoming a certain or complying with a certain criterion. So warning criterion, you have criteria, and therefore could be one, could be many. You define what you need in your system for your prediction. The prediction is at the level of the landslide model to become a warning. And then what is the meaning of the warning? As I mentioned to you in that example where I was showing to you the table from Italy, the territorial scale, yellow may mean, so I was showing to you essentially the warning events. Yellow may mean occasional debris flows. Orange may mean diffuse debris flows. Red may mean diffuse and numerous debris flows. How do you get to yellow, orange, or red? By means of certain criteria. We didn't discuss them yet. And all of those have to be based on a model, a forecasting model, a landslide model that you have at the center of your system. I'm saying at the center because then when I see the system is indeed everything Therefore, the system is the landslide model plus these two things. Therefore, the warning model plus other important components. Warning dissemination. How do you communicate? How do you communication education is how do you address the people that you're addressing in your specific area or community? But how do you disseminate the warning? By means of a siren, by means of people running around and saying, watch out, something may happen, by means of bulletins, web dissemination, all of those are strategies, dissemination, communication and education. How do you engage people, community involvement? And finally, what is your emergency plan? You know, what do you state for people to do when you issue certain warnings? So all of those are key components of a warning system. So if you think about what, in my view, are the key components of weather-induced landslide early warning systems, they are all of these. All of these. Then these are grouped in a landslide model. At the level of the landslide model, you have the forecasting of your phenomena, weather-induced landslides. At the level of the warning model, you have the definition of warning criteria and what warning events are. At a higher level, let's say there is also, let's not say higher, there is also the level of what's missing after the warning model. Are you done? No, you're not done. After the warning model, you have to think about warning communication, warning dissemination, communication and education, community involvement, and the emergency plan for your specific landslide system or area of interest. Okay, this is a good time for me to take a break, drink a little bit of water, take a little break. So I will stop the recording here, and then I will start with the recording part 2 soon after that. So let's stop it.